9 Golden Age performers who were clandestinely being probed. Studio executives would pay millions to keep the dark secrets of Hollywood's Golden Age hidden behind the glitzy premieres, renowned performances, and meticulously staged marketing images. Many of these legendary actors were being surreptitiously monitored, pursued, and investigated by authorities who had suspicions while they ruled the world of cinema and magazine covers. Studio cover-ups meant to safeguard their most prized assets. Confidential data, undercover monitoring, and so on were never made public. Celebrities whose likenesses sold millions of tickets. These background checks weren't your average ones. Extensive criminal investigations were underway, with the potential to abruptly put a stop to entire industries and professions. Here we reveal 9 iconic figures from that era who posed for photos while police formed cases against them. These tales show the seedier side of Hollywood's most glitzy period, from federal investigators tapping phone lines to studio moguls eradicating evidence. In the end, several of these stars were cleared. The consequences of their acts were severe for others. They all led double lives, nevertheless. Loved figures on film, and people who are under tight scrutiny off camera. It's startling that these stars were accused, but what's even more astonishing is the lengths to which the studios went to protect them. If these investigations had been front-page news, our perspective of Hollywood history may have been different. I don't want to be the one to say it again, but you are stunning. The most amazing thing. The scandal involving Errol Flynn in 1942 almost put an end to swashbuckling. Viewers saw the ideal hero, a dashing, charismatic, and enticing Errol Flynn, as he swashbuckled across the screen as Captain Blood or Robin Hood. The individual was under investigation by the Los Angeles Police Department for offenses that would shock even the most scandal-stricken members of the public, but they failed to notice him. While Flynn was at the peak of his stardom in 1942, he was officially accused with major crimes involving 2 minor females at parties in Hollywood. A full-scale inquiry was launched after what started as rumors, endangering not only Flynn's career, but the entire studio system that had propelled him to stardom. According to a former publicist for Warner Brothers, who recalled the incident decades later, the press referred to it as the Robin Hood controversy. The studio used all of their favors. Everywhere you went in Los Angeles, you could hear the phones ringing in police stations, press offices, and courtrooms. The sheer scope of the study is something that many cinema historians seem to have lost track of. Investigators questioned a large number of teenage girls. Reports surfaced of studio representatives approaching potential witnesses with monetary or professional incentives for favorable testimony, or even just vanishing until the trial was over. The studio-funded defense team representing Flynn painted the actor as a helpless victim of greedy families and opportunistic young women. They shockingly turned a serious criminal case into a sly joke about masculine conquest by introducing the phrase, "in like Flynn," to the American vernacular, which was a crass reference to the star's purported sexual prowess. The plan was successful. After a trial that devolved into a farce rather than a formal process, Flynn was found not guilty. However, a significant aspect of Hollywood had been exposed by the study. In the studio system, there was more than meets the eye. A protection racket for its prize stars, it could use military-grade precision to influence law enforcement, manipulate the press, and shape public opinion. Despite the lasting damage to his reputation, Flynn's career went on. Even while he kept making movies in the 1940s, the innocent charisma that had characterized his early roles had transformed into a more jaded version of himself. Although viewers continued to applaud his heroic portrayal, the research had exposed the chasm that existed between Flynn and the disturbed man he really was. This pattern would be repeated by several Hollywood stars who were subjected to comparable scrutiny. Then, let us exercise that authority in the sake of democracy. We must come together. Charlie Chaplin, you say? When the underdog battled the FBI, few actors became as famous as Charlie Chaplin, whose diminutive stature elevated him to the status of cultural hero. Although Chaplin is a famous cinematic character, he was actually the target of one of the longest-running government investigations in Hollywood's history. An effort that the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigations, FBI, J. Hoover Edgar, a nation laughed at him. A film historian who focuses on the relationship between Hollywood and government organizations claimed that Hoover wanted him removed from office. Hoover despised Chaplin for his foreign origin, liberal politics, and unethical behavior, all of which he epitomized. Chaplin was the subject of a very thorough examination by the FBI. Secret Service agents listened in on his conversations, read his correspondence, and amassed a dossier that would grow to be thousands of pages long. They probed his political ties, looking for signs of communist inclinations throughout the Cold War in particular. However, the details of Chaplin's private life piqued the curiosity of Hoover's agents, who could use them as criminal prosecution material. Chaplin faced charges of breaking the Mann Act in 1944, which forbade the transnational movement of women for hedonistic reasons. Actress Joan Barry was the subject of the case. Chaplin had a romantic relationship with Barry, but subsequent blood testing proved he could not have fathered Barry's child. The popular perception of the elderly celebrity plummeted as a result of the court actions. A legal scholar pointed out that safeguarding women was never the true goal of the Mann Act inquiry. It was a method the state employed to target certain individuals for ulterior motives. Their opportunity to take advantage of Chaplin's personal life and political frailty presented itself. As Hollywood was engulfed in the Red Scare in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the pressure on Chaplin grew. He was never a member of the Communist Party, but his vocal resistance to McCarthyism and his insistence on being a non-citizen despite decades of residency in the U.S. made him an easy target. The tipping point occurred in 1952, when Chaplin departed from the U.S. for the Limelight premiere in London. His re-entry permit had been withdrawn, he found out while abroad. He would face political and moral character questions if he decided to go back to the United States, where he had resided for 40 years and established his illustrious career. Instead of resigning, the chaplaincy moved into exile. In an unhealthy climate where liberal-minded persons can be picked out and punished, I have been the target of propaganda and lies spread by influential conservative groups with the help of America's yellow press. He said he would stay away from America for 20 years, and the only time he did come back was to accept an honorary Oscar in 1972. A terrible side of celebrity in mid-century America was shown by the FBI's unrelenting pursuit of the priest. Just how susceptible even the most popular artists are to backlash when they question established moral or political norms, and how swiftly public adulation may transform into distrust. Chaplin and his supporters could not miss the sour irony of being expelled from the nation due to a government probe, given that he had amassed his wealth by making Americans laugh. It's not always effective, but I've tried saying that. Very often, I bang my head. The 50s and 60s were the era of Rock Hudson's covert insurance investigation. On screen, Rock Hudson personified a particular brand of American masculinity. Clearly heterosexual, tall, and good-looking. He became one of Hollywood's most bankable actors thanks to his romantic comedies with Doris Day, a role that relied heavily on him preserving his meticulously crafted public persona. Although studio bosses were worried about Hudson's career taking a nosedive if the public found out he was gay, audiences were unaware of this truth. One of the most peculiar investigations in Hollywood was prompted by this worry. The insurance firms who are funding Hudson's massive film contracts secretly commissioned the investigation, not the police. According to an interview with a former executive from Universal Pictures, studios engaged private investigators to confirm that Hudson was straight in order to fulfill the morals provisions in his large contracts. People discreetly photographed him, followed him, and interrogated him. Although his likeness appeared on billboards, he lived a life behind bars. When compared to how things are now, the probes were shockingly invasive. Photographs of Hudson's guests were taken by private investigators who kept tabs on his residence and wrote extensive reports about his private life. In an effort to dispel rumors about his sexuality, the celebrity was coerced into attending studio-arranged dates with actresses and female contract players. An expert on Hollywood history clarified that these were no ordinary safety measures. There was a tremendous amount of money at risk. Hudson's contracts include morals clauses that would have immediately barred him from receiving any of the millions of dollars that would have been earned by his films had his homosexuality come to light. Ensuring studio investments that were worth hundreds of millions of dollars in today's dollars was a top priority. When a tabloid promised to publish an exposé about gay Hollywood stars in the early 1960s, the pressure mounted. The publication was swiftly shut down by studio fixers and cooperative law enforcement officers, but the incident triggered even stricter surveillance of Hudson's personal life. When Hudson died of AIDS-related problems in 1985, at the age of 51, another layer of the mystery was exposed, adding decades to the investigation. Several sources state that Reagan administration officials, including several with Hollywood connections, were worried about how the public would perceive the AIDS epidemic and wanted to protect Hudson's privacy, so they held off on releasing details about his condition. According to one AIDS activist who was active in the 1980s Hollywood scene, the probes into Hudson's personal life were never truly concluded. His career was shielded, and now his legacy will be managed. One of the darkest aspects of Hollywood investigations is shown in Hudson's narrative. One that isn't caused by real misconduct, but rather by the entertainment industry's dread of how fans would respond to a celebrity's true self. Hudson was only ever in trouble for being gay during a time when that was enough to ruin a career, unlike other celebrities who were investigated for real crimes. How much the studio system controlled its stars, and what was at risk if that control failed, are shown by the resources spent on examining and hiding his private life. The inquiry involving Fatty Arbuckle had a lasting impact on Hollywood. Even though Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle's career peaked just before Hollywood's real golden age, his trial in 1921 had such a profound impact on the business that studios began managing stars differently for decades afterward. Before a tragic incident at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, Arbuckle appeared untouchable as one of the biggest stars of silent film, having earned an extraordinary $1 million deal with Paramount. A young actress named Virginia Rapp was at the party when she became very sick and eventually died of peritonitis due to a burst bladder. The subsequent inquiry was among the most high-profile felony cases in the annals of early Hollywood. The accusation against Arbuckle was that he brutally assaulted her, causing the internal injuries that ultimately proved fatal. According to a silent-era film expert, he was the first Hollywood celebrity to go down, and with him, the industry's innocence. Studios hardly ever kept tabs on their stars' whereabouts before Arbuckle. Following in his footsteps, whole divisions were established to ensure the safety of both the stars and the studio. An aggressive and widely publicized inquiry was carried out by the San Francisco Police Department. Some partygoers said they heard Rapp screaming from behind a locked door, while others maintained Arbuckle was only trying to help the sick woman. There was a lot of sensationalism in the media, and everyone assumed Arbuckle was guilty. As the publications owned by William Randolph Hearst spearheaded the accusations against the comic. Even though the jury went to the extreme measure of writing an apology to Arbuckle after the first two trials resulted in hung juries, the actor was still wrongfully convicted and eventually acquitted, but the harm had already been done. The establishment of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, MPPPDA, presided over by former Postmaster General Will Hayes, was prompted by the public's indignation over the case and the graphic portrayal of Hollywood excess, in an effort to restore the industry's reputation. Studio heads were so worried about future scandals that they instituted departments to spy on their stars' personal life and included morality clauses in celebrity contracts. A team of in-house security guards was given carte blanche to clean up embarrassing situations before the media or authorities could intervene, and private investigators were employed to track famous people. His career was ruined, his pictures were banned, his contract was canceled, and Arbuckle's name became a byword for Hollywood filth, even though he was cleared in court. He never recovered from his decline and died in 1933, even though he did resume his career as a director in 1934, this time using the pseudonym William Goodrich. The Arbuckle investigation laid the groundwork for decades of similar probes. Studios would employ all of their political, financial, and legal clout to either suppress or manipulate news coverage of a star's alleged major transgressions. In reaction to the Arbuckle case, a preventative strategy for star management was developed to shield subsequent stars like Flynn and Hudson from potential difficulties before they became public knowledge. Stars of the golden age of Hollywood learned their lesson from Arbuckle's demise. It didn't matter how famous you become. The studio system would always have the last say. The kind of system that would keep you safe until it thought you were more interesting to tell your story than anything else. You gals have a name, but it has no place in high society beyond the confines of a kennel. Yours truly, madam. Joan Crawford starred in the film, investigating the matter of child welfare. Christina, Joan Crawford's adopted daughter, wrote the caustic memoir Mommy Dearest, which permanently stained Joan's reputation as a mother. Although that book didn't come out until decades later, rumors circulated in Hollywood that Crawford's house had been the focus of clandestine child welfare investigations, questions that the studios discreetly and rapidly answered. According to one film historian, the stories regarding social workers visiting Crawford's Brentwood house in the 1940s and 1950s were captured in the Oscar-winning film The Cruel Mother, and the files that might have been sealed forever. Several people close to Crawford at this period have confirmed that there were concerns regarding her treatment of her adopted children, Christina and Christopher in particular, but no formal records of these inquiries have ever been made public, assuming they still exist at all. Anonymous abuse tips led a biographer to interview numerous Crawford household staff members, and according to various former employees, social workers showed up unannounced at Crawford's home to investigate. This was not officially confirmed at the time, but it was later proven. The studio had prearranged for specific officials to notify them promptly upon receipt of any concerns. Those in charge of child welfare and other local government departments were reportedly close associates of MGM and later Warner Brothers. The studio's fixers would be informed before any formal action could be taken in response to complaints lodged by worried domestic staff, neighbors, or anybody else who had observed disturbing behavior. An ex-employee of the studio described how the system operated in this way. After receiving a complaint, an individual from the agency would promptly contact their studio contact. As a result, lawyers, publicists, and occasionally even studio executives would rush to Crawford's residence prior to the arrival of the social workers, all within a matter of hours. Control of the narrative had already taken place prior to the launch of any formal investigation. After Christina Crawford's memoir recounted accusations of mental and physical abuse, the stories gained credibility decades later. Despite skepticism over Christina's story, numerous credible sources have verified that Joan Crawford's parenting during her stardom was a matter of concern. These were legitimate concerns that were covered up in order to shield a very popular female Hollywood star. The Crawford case stands out because it shows how the studio systems are used for civil and administrative issues as well as criminal ones. Preventing child welfare inquiries from jeopardizing a celebrity's well-crafted public image seems to be within the purview of the same machinery that may impact courts and police departments. Despite these purported investigations, Crawford persisted in adopting children, building a public image as a dedicated single mother. Her own grit and the studio's resilience in the face of danger are both honored. Her public persona as the perfect mother and the truth as told by housekeepers are starkly at odds with one another, illustrating the incredible influence of the studio's publicity machine to influence public opinion irrespective of facts. One of the most disturbing examples of the priority system in Golden Age Hollywood would be these investigations, if they were actually real and buried. A system where the financial worth of a celebrity might ostensibly supersede concerns for children's well-being. Do you keep in touch with your loved ones? Of course I can. Very well done. Is this a guy? Marlon Brando became involved with son's murder investigation. Although he had lost much of the revolutionary energy that had changed American acting in the 1950s, Marlon Brando remained a renowned figure in Hollywood and an icon whose Los Angeles mansion was heavily guarded for his privacy in 1990. His son Christian Brando's arrest for the murder of Dog Drawlett, Marlon's daughter Cheyenne's lover, at the actor's Mulholland Drive house destroyed that solitude. The Los Angeles Police Department and the District Attorney's Office swiftly broadened their investigation to encompass Marlon as well, asking the renowned actor what he knew about threats against Droll and whether he might have attempted to conceal any parts of the crime, even though Christian was initially charged with the crime. A family fell apart behind the Godfather's gate, and the LAPD took notes, stated a cop who worked on the case. This wasn't just about Christian. We had questions about what Marlon knew, when he knew it, and what he might have done after the shooting. According to multiple sources, Brando was interviewed extensively by investigators who were particularly interested in phone calls between father and son in the days leading up to the homicide. Christian had allegedly told his father about Droll's supposed abuse of Cheyenne, and prosecutors wanted to know whether Marlon had encouraged his son's confrontational approach. More troubling for investigators were the chaotic hours immediately following the shooting when Brando allegedly took control of the scene before police arrived. Some reports suggested evidence might have been disturbed, while others claimed Brando coached his son on what to tell authorities. Marlon Brando wasn't just a witness. He was a potential accessory after the fact, claimed a former prosecutor familiar with the case. There were serious discussions about charging him, but the evidence was ultimately too ambiguous, and nobody wanted to take on a figure of his stature without an airtight case. Unlike earlier studio-era scandals, where publicity departments controlled the narrative, the Brando case played out in a more modern media environment. Still, echoes of the old system remain. Major publications treated Brando with notable difference, focusing on the tragedy of a father losing a son to prison rather than the actor's own potential culpability. Television coverage largely avoided suggestions that Brando himself might be legally compromised, instead portraying him as a grieving father. Christian Brando ultimately pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and served 5 years in prison. Cheyenne, traumatized by the events and suffering from mental illness, committed suicide in 1995. Marlon Brando retreated further from public life, his final years marked by the family tragedy that had exposed him to criminal investigation. The case illustrated how even in the modern era, Hollywood royalty received different treatment from ordinary citizens. While investigators did pursue questions about Marlon's involvement, the threshold for taking action against him was clearly higher than it would have been for someone without his iconic status. The old studio system of protection had evolved, but not disappeared. It had simply become more subtle in how it shielded the industry's most valuable names. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. Bing Crosby, the domestic violence allegations. For millions of Americans, Bing Crosby's voice was the sound of Christmas. His crooning rendition of White Christmas, a beloved holiday tradition. His screen persona, easygoing, gentle, paternal, made him one of Hollywood's most trusted stars, a man who represented traditional American values at their most appealing. Yet behind this wholesome image lurked disturbing allegations that sparked multiple police responses to the Crosby home. Though these incidents remained hidden from public view for decades, the voice of Christmas, the hand that held a belt, was how one Crosby biographer starkly characterized the contradiction between the star's public and private personas. According to multiple sources, including members of Crosby's household staff and neighbors, the Los Angeles Police Department responded to several domestic disturbance calls at the Crosby estate during the 1940s and 1950s. These calls allegedly involved volatile confrontations between Crosby and his first wife, Dixie Lee, as well as incidents involving their 4 sons, particularly Gary, who would later detail abuse in his controversial memoir, Going My Own Way. Rumors circulated that LAPD responded to multiple domestic violence calls at Crosby's estate, especially involving son Gary, confirmed a retired LAPD officer who served during this period. The studio allegedly intervened and no official charges were filed. These kinds of calls involving celebrities were handled differently back then. They never went through normal channels. The system for managing such incidents was well established by the time Crosby became a star. Studio representatives maintained close relationships with key figures in law enforcement, from beat officers to police chiefs. When domestic disturbances occurred involving valuable performers, these connections ensured that incidents were documented minimally, if at all, and that officers were encouraged to view such situations as private matters rather than potential criminal cases. Paramount had people whose entire job was handling these kinds of situations, explained a former studio employee. They maintained lists of which officers and supervisors could be counted on to be discreet, which really meant covering things up. Cash changed hands. Promises of set visits were made. Sometimes even bit parts in movies were offered. Whatever it took to make problems go away. The allegations remained largely hidden until 1983, when Gary Crosby's memoir described his father as physically abusive and emotionally distant, a portrait that contradicted everything the public thought they knew about Bing. While some family members disputed Gary's account, his brothers Lindsay and Dennis later supported many of his claims, suggesting a pattern of behavior that aligned with the rumored police responses decades earlier. What makes the Crosby case particularly significant is how completely the star's image was protected throughout his life and beyond. Unlike stars, whose personal scandals became public during their careers, Crosby maintained his wholesome reputation virtually unblemished until years after his death. The investigations that might have revealed his private behavior were so effectively suppressed that not even a whisper of them appeared in the press during his lifetime. This absolute protection reflects both Crosby's enormous commercial value. He was not just a film star, but a multimedia phenomenon whose recordings, radio shows, and films generated millions. And the different standards applied to domestic incidents during this era. What today might trigger arrests and public charges was then considered a private family matter, particularly when the family in question was headed by one of America's most beloved entertainers. Sit them people walk by, and they say, "Is that you?" And I say, "Yes." George Raft. FBI files mob ties. While many actors of Hollywood's golden age played gangsters on screen, George Raft lived with the shadow of real organized crime figures throughout his career. His slick gangster performances in films like Scarface of 1932 weren't just acting. They were informed by his genuine connections to some of America's most notorious criminals. Connections that made him the subject of extensive FBI investigation for decades. He played gangsters on screen and protected them off it, noted a crime historian who has studied FBI files from this period. Raft wasn't just adjacent to organized crime. He was deeply embedded in its social and business networks. Raft's friendship with mobsters like Bugsy Siegel and Meir Lansky dated back to his early days as a dancer in New York City when he became a Hollywood star. These relationships continued with Raft allegedly serving as a bridge between the entertainment industry and organized crime figures who were increasingly interested in legitimate investments in casinos, nightclubs, and even film production. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's leadership, monitored Raft extensively. His FBI file eventually grew to hundreds of pages documenting his travels, associations, and financial transactions. Agents investigated allegations that Raft was involved in money laundering schemes, using his celebrity status to move funds for crime organizations or to serve as a front for their investments in seemingly legitimate businesses. Raft was investigated repeatedly for laundering, bribery, and casino ownership schemes, confirmed a researcher who has reviewed Raft's FBI file. His contracts were often reviewed by federal agents before film approvals. The FBI was particularly interested in trips he made to Havana and Las Vegas, where he appeared to be acting as a representative for hidden mob interests in casinos. What made Raft's case unusual was how openly he maintained these controversial friendships even as they threatened his career. While other stars went to great lengths to hide potential scandals, Raft seemed almost proud of his underworld connections, perhaps believing his star status made him untouchable. Studio executives, normally hyper-vigilant about protecting their investments, took a different approach with Raft. Rather than trying to sever his mob ties, they used them as part of his mystique, allowing the line between his on-screen persona and off-screen life to blur in a way that enhanced his credibility in gangster roles. This strategy worked until the late 1940s when the FBI's investigations became more public and Raft's associations began to limit his career opportunities. The studios tolerated Raft's connections until they couldn't anymore, explained a film historian. As the public and government concern about organized crime grew in the post-war years, Raft became too hot to handle. His career declined, not because his acting abilities diminished, but because his real-life associations had finally caught up with him. Raft's story reveals a different dimension of Hollywood's relationship with investigations. One where a star's questionable associations were initially tolerated or even exploited for publicity value, only to become liabilities when broader social and political attitudes shift. Unlike stars who were protected from the consequences of their actions, Raft ultimately paid a professional price for the very connections that had once added to his on-screen credibility. High-top shoes and my hair piled high up on my head. Judy Garland studio medical cover-ups. When Judy Garland skipped down the yellow brick road in The Wizard of Oz, she became America's sweetheart, the talented girl next door with the voice of an angel. What audiences didn't see was the system of studio-mandated drug use that kept her working through punishing schedules. A system that eventually led to addiction and, according to several accounts, triggered a confidential investigation that was quickly suppressed. The pills were handed out like candy, but someone new and tried to stop it, revealed a former MGM employee who worked closely with the studio's medical staff in the 1940s. From her earliest days at MGM, Garland was introduced to a regimen of amphetamines to control her weight and help her work long hours, followed by barbiturates to help her sleep. This practice wasn't unique to Garland. Many stars were given similar medication by studio doctors, but the extremity of her case and her young age made it particularly troubling. According to several accounts, this system briefly came under scrutiny when a conscientious physician new to the studio system raised concerns about the number of prescriptions being written for Garland, who was still a teenager when The Wizard of Oz was filmed. This doctor allegedly contacted the Los Angeles Police Department's narcotics division, triggering a quiet inquiry into prescription practices at MGM. There were whispers that Garland's doctors may have violated controlled substance laws, with the studio orchestrating over-prescription cover-ups, confirmed a Hollywood historian who has researched this period. An LAPD narcotics unit reportedly opened a file, but closed it quickly under studio pressure. The investigation never gained traction. Within days of the initial inquiry, studio executives had mobilized their considerable influence. The concerned doctor was allegedly dismissed. Police supervisors intervened to close the preliminary investigation, and Garland's drug regimen continued under different medical supervision. MGM wasn't just a studio. It was practically its own government, explained a film industry attorney. They had former judges on retainer, close relationships with the district attorney's office, and even paid regular stipends to certain police officials. When they decided something wasn't going to be investigated, it wasn't investigated. The consequences for Garland were devastating. By her early 20s, she was already struggling with the addiction that would plague her for the rest of her life. Her physical and mental health deteriorated, leading to suicide attempts and increasingly erratic behavior that eventually ended her MGM contract in 1950. The investigation that might have exposed the studio's role in creating her addiction was so thoroughly suppressed that it remained unknown to the public for decades. Only in recent years, as historians have gained access to private correspondence and interviewed aging studio employees, has this attempted intervention come to light. Garland's story illustrates perhaps the most insidious aspect of the studio protection system, not just covering up stars' misdeeds, but actively creating conditions that damage them while simultaneously shutting down any outside efforts to address those conditions. The brief aborted investigation into her medical treatment represents a moment when external oversight might have changed the trajectory of her troubled life had it not been for the studio's overwhelming power to control the narrative. When I was 11, then when I was 14, rather seriously when I was 14, and finally when I was 16, I went to California. Robert Mitchum, the drug raid that backfired. In an era when a single scandal could end a career overnight, Robert Mitchum somehow managed to turn a highly publicized drug arrest into a boost for his rebellious image. When Los Angeles police officers raided a Hollywood Hills home in 1948 and arrested Mitchum for marijuana possession, it should have been a career-destroying moment. Instead, it became a case study in how a star's response to investigation could sometimes matter more than the investigation itself. He did the time and turned it into legend, noted a film historian who has studied how different stars navigated public scandals during the studio era. Unlike the hushed-up investigations of many of his contemporaries, Mitchum's case played out very publicly. The LAPD Vice Squad had specifically targeted the actor, setting up a sting operation at a private residence and ensuring photographers were present to document his arrest. The resulting images, Mitchum being led away in handcuffs, made front pages across the country. RKO Mitchum Studio initially panicked, coming at a time when morality clauses were standard in star contracts. The arrest could have given the studio grounds to fire Mitchum without further compensation. Industry observers predicted his career was finished, especially after he was convicted and sentenced to 60 days in jail. Studios tried to bury the story, but it leaked, explained an entertainment lawyer familiar with the case. What made Mitchum's situation different was his response. He didn't deny it, didn't make excuses. When asked about his time in jail potentially ruining his career, he famously shrugged and said, "It's like being blackballed by a country club I never wanted to join in the first place." This nonchalant attitude, combined with Mitchum's natural screen charisma and tough guy persona, resonated with audiences in unexpected ways. Rather than being repulsed by his lawbreaking, many fans found his authenticity refreshing in an industry built on artifice. When he was released from jail and returned to work, his films performed even better than before his arrest. The investigation that was meant to end Mitchum's career instead cemented his reputation as Hollywood's authentic bad boy, a reputation that would sustain him through a 5-decade career. While studios continued trying to protect their stars from scandal through elaborate cover-ups and interventions, Mitchum's case suggested an alternative approach. Sometimes owning a scandal could be more effective than hiding it. Mitchum understood something fundamental about his appeal that the studio executives didn't, said a biographer who has written extensively about the actor. His fans didn't love him because they thought he was perfect. They loved him because he seemed real in an industry of fakes. The arrest just confirmed what they already suspected, that the dangerous characters he played weren't much of a stretch. As the final story in our exploration of Hollywood investigations, Mitchum's case offers a fitting conclusion, a reminder that even in an era of carefully controlled star images, authentic personality could sometimes transcend scandal in ways that studio fixers with all their power and resources could never have engineered.